Central New York News carried this story in October 2012. 28-year-old Arthur Bundridge robbed the Alliance Bank in Syracuse, New York, handing the teller a note demanding $20,000. She scooped up some cash and put it in a bag and handed it to him, and he fled the scene. She immediately sounded the alarm. When Mr. Bundridge got home, he began to count out his money and found out that the teller had only given him $1,100, not the $20,000 he had demanded. He was so angry that he returned to the bank to lodge a complaint and get the rest of the money. Upon his arrival, he was apprehended and charged with fourth-degree grand larceny. Some people will complain about anything. This Thursday, we celebrate Thanksgiving, and we have so much to be thankful for. We live in the greatest and the most democratic and free and the wealthiest nation in the world. Even though we are currently in some kind of an economic downturn, we are still wealthier than most of the other people in the world. In fact, it has been statistically shown that the 20% poorest people in our nation are wealthier than the average person in most other nations. Using that statistic, it's been determined that if those 20% poorest U.S. citizens became a nation of their own, they would have the 12th strongest economy in the world. That puts things into perspective, doesn't it, about how blessed we are. This is an aha moment of realization for us that even in this time of inflation and weaker economy, God has blessed us richly. But are we truly appreciative of that? A March 28th article in Psychology Today of this year reported that Americans rank 23rd in the international ranking of happiness. In other words, the average person in 22 other countries are more happy than the average American person is, despite the fact that our nation ranks number one in material blessings. The Declaration of Independence guarantees us the right to pursue happiness, and we do. But apparently, happiness continues to elude us. And the reason might be because we keep chasing after more. We are unable to be content with what we have. What we have is fine for a while, but soon we reach the point where it's no longer enough. We want more and nicer and newer and better. For example, consider this likely scenario. You've been hoping for a new minivan to transport your growing family in comfort and style. The old sedan that you had when you were first married is no longer sufficient. You've determined from your research that the Honda Odyssey has all the features you need. That's the car to have, you tell yourself. I wish I had it instead of this old thing. And so you begin to save, and you dream, and you try to find a way to afford it. And then one day it happens. The financing comes together, and you drive home off of the car lot with a brand new Honda Odyssey. You just love it. You love it so much, in fact, that you wash it and vacuum the interior every week. But after 4 or 5 months, you wash it every 2 or 3 weeks, and you vacuum the interior just occasionally. And then after another 4 or 5 months, you just let it sit out in the rain to wash the dirt away, and you can't remember the last time you vacuumed the interior. A moldy chicken McNugget is wedged somewhere between the seats, and it's giving off a foul odor. Someone spilled Coke on the console. You tried to dab it up, but you weren't able to get rid of all the stickiness it reminds you every time you touch it. One of the kids sat on a French fry and mashed it into the upholstery of the back seat, and now it's become a part of your car. The front windshield has a stone chip in it right at eye level, and every time you look out the car windshield as you drive, it irritates you. You spilled ketchup and mayonnaise from a sandwich you were eating on the go right between your legs, and now there's a permanent stain on your front seat. The car has lost its luster. So while you were driving one day, you spot someone driving a brand new Lincoln Aviator SUV, and you just love it. That's the car to have, you tell yourself. I wish I had it instead of this old thing. Isn't that realistic? Isn't that human nature? We want more money, nicer things, a newer car, a better life. We just can't stay happy with what we have. We are unable to find contentment. And so the Apostle Paul has a message for us, advising us to rise above our discontent. Let's read it in Philippians 2, verses 14 and 15. Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. Do everything without grumbling, Paul says. Are you good at that? I'm not very good at that. Some of the synonyms used in other translations for that word grumbling there in the New International Version include complaining. We understand that word. Or murmuring. It's the vocalization of discontent that Paul is writing about. He wasn't referring to legitimate grievances. Sometimes a problem needs to be identified in order to be properly addressed. But instead, he warns us to guard against the temptation to complain about everything. The chronic complainer is never satisfied. That person complains and murmurs and grumbles on and on. Maybe it's because he or she is a perfectionist and nothing ever measures up to expectations. Or maybe that person is negative and always sees the worst in things. Maybe it's a person who takes pleasure in picking things apart. It's been said that the easiest thing to find is fault. Or maybe it's someone who just wants more and is not patient enough or willing to work hard enough in order to have it. Last week I was in a hardware store to buy spray paint. 2 young female employees were a few feet down the aisle from me. They were there talking when I arrived, and they were there still talking after I left, and I couldn't help but overhear their conversation. One of them was telling the other that she hoped that the manager would give her review soon. It was long overdue, she said. She said that she had not received a review yet, and so therefore she had not received a raise yet. And she was moaning about how difficult it was to live on the amount of money that she was making there. She said she needed a raise. She said she worked hard and she deserved a raise, and she'd better get one soon, and the manager better give her her review. I stood there comparing paint colors and prices for several minutes, longer than I should have, mostly because I wanted to stay and listen to that conversation. I knew this sermon was coming up, and I was hoping she would give me a good sermon illustration, and she did. As I sat listening to her complain about the manager and not getting a review and not having a raise and not making enough money, even though she was such a good worker, I caught myself wondering just how good a worker she really is. She'd been wasting, at that point, over 10 minutes of her time in a back aisle of the store complaining instead of doing her job. I thought if she worked as hard as she complained, she'd probably already have that raise. And maybe that's why the manager hadn't given her the review and the raise yet, because she complains instead of works? Do we? Is complaining something that we default to? As I mentioned, there are 3 English words for the Greek word that's used in the verse of our text today. Some of the versions use the word complain. Others use the word murmur. Others use the word grumbling. A couple of those words, especially murmur and grumble, those are onomatopoetic words. That means they sound like what the process they are trying to describe. For instance, shriek is an onomatopoetic word. It sounds like what it describes. And so is groan. Groan is an onomatopoetic word. And so is murmur. And so is grumble. Let's take a little test in order to demonstrate that to ourselves. It's going to require all of us participating together. So here's what I would like for you to do. On the count of 3, I would like for all of us to say the word grumble out loud together at the same time. Repeat it 4 times. Are you ready? 1, 2, 3. Grumble, 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 grumble. Doesn't that sound like grumbling to you? I wonder if that's what it sounds like to God's ears when he hears all these people grumbling and murmuring and complaining about their life and what they don't have and what they need. It must have sounded that way to Moses as he was leading the Israelites out of Egypt, because they constantly complained over and over, the scriptures tell us. God had provided greatly for Israel as they made their escape from slavery. In the first 3 months of their journey, God performed 4 great miracles of provision for them. In order to demonstrate that he was there with them, he knew what they needed, and he would always provide it, and they wouldn't have to worry about a thing. In Exodus 15, for instance, God turned stagnant water into good water, so they had water to drink. In the next chapter, God sent manna, promising these words, "I will rain down bread from heaven for you." And he kept that miracle going daily for 40 years. In that same chapter, we read that God sent a vast flock of quail to settle around the camp so that those 2 million plus people had meat. In chapter 17, God miraculously made water flow from a mountainside. But on and on they grumbled and complained. Nothing was enough. They weren't satisfied with God's provision. Can't you just hear them? "We're out of water, Moses." "Where's the beef, Moses?" "My feet hurt, Moses." "Are we there yet, Moses?" "How much longer, Moses?" "Manna again, Moses?" In Exodus 17:2, Moses told the people that by their complaining, they were testing the Lord. That word testing there, in the Hebrew, it's actually a word for a legal process. It's legal terminology. What it really means is they were putting God on trial. And in fact, they not only put God on trial, but they found him guilty. They found God guilty of not providing for them well enough. They found God guilty of not doing more for them. They were so discontented that they placed their desire for more and for better and for new above their respect for God. And they blamed him for the lack they felt. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, the Apostle Paul refers to this story of the Exodus. And in his reference, he listed the worst sins that Israel committed during that time. And in that list was the sin of murmuring. Murmuring, complaining, grumbling was one of the worst sins they committed. Discontent, which leads to complaining, is a sin. The sin of murmuring and grumbling and complaining is expressing our discontent for what God has provided for us and believing that God is not taking good care of us. Benjamin Franklin once said, "Constant complaint is the poorest sort of pay for all the comforts we enjoy." Isn't that profound? I think it's true. Constant complaint is the poorest sort of pay for all the comforts we enjoy. We, among all the people on earth, are most richly blessed. We have enough food and closets full of clothing. We have shelter and climate control to adjust the temperature in that shelter 365 days a year to suit us at the moment. We have the world's best health care at our fingertips. We have the world's greatest natural resources in our earth. And we have the cutting-edge technology available to us, which makes our life easier. We are so blessed. And Americans are among the world's wealthiest people. But our constant complaining, our lack of contentment minimizes those blessings. If we took the time to count our many blessings, we would see that God is taking good care of us. We are so fortunate. So Paul says, do not complain. And then he adds that by not complaining, we will set ourselves apart from the rest of the world. He said it this way, you will shine like stars. We will shine like stars in this fallen and darkened world. We will be that much obvious compared to the rest of the world if we just simply stop complaining. Paul says if we stop complaining compared to the rest of the world, we will be blameless and pure, children of God without fault. How refreshing it must be to God's ears to not hear griping and complaining from his happy, contented children. I like the way the Message Bible words verse 15 when it says, go out into the world uncorrupted. A breath of fresh air in this squalid and polluted society. That's what it's like when we don't complain. When we speak words that are positive instead of negative. We're like a breath of fresh air in this corrupted culture. Let's go back to verse 14 again. Do everything without complaining. How do we do that? How do we break that complaining habit that seems to settle in on us? One way, I think, is to take Paul's advice from 1 Thessalonians 5:18 when he said, in everything, give thanks. Do everything without complaining. Instead, in everything, give thanks. Paul didn't write that because he had every blessing he thought he should have. In fact, he wrote those words from a prison cell. Because of his ministry for Jesus Christ, Paul had suffered many beatings and death threats. He was arrested several times. He was stoned and left for dead on one occasion. His life was in jeopardy on a few other occasions. That's why he wrote these words in verse 12. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. Paul had been there. He had been in need. He had suffered. He knew what it was to suffer. And then the rest of the verse, he stated that he had a secret. For I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. What was that secret? What was the secret that enabled him to be content no matter what his circumstances? He tells us in verse 13, I can do all this through Christ who gives me strength. Jesus provided him with something that strengthened him, something that gave him a better perspective, something that enabled him to be content whatever his situation. What a witness that must have been to his readers. And what a witness it is to our world when we can make the same claim. When we can be happy even in poor circumstances. When we can be positive, finding the blessing in all things. When we can speak words of praise instead of complaint. Because we know a secret. And that secret is this: contentment is not based upon what we have. It's based upon who we are. And Paul identified us as the children of God. We have a great Father who will take care of us. That's all we need. Complaining promotes ingratitude. How can we do that? Overcome that ingratitude and stop that complaining, as the Apostle Paul wrote. The antidote for the infection of complaining is to remember God's graciousness and his provision. When we remember that it comes from God, it makes us more grateful and less focused on what we do not have. And so remind yourself frequently that God has provided for you. If you journal, make that an entry in your journal and then reread it each morning. Remember it in prayerful gratitude daily. Remember, all gifts come from God. Let's go back to the Exodus again briefly. Israel had been given their menu for the next 40 years, manna from heaven, the very bread of heaven, maybe what the angels eat, maybe what will be our eternal food. Something that the Bible describes as kind of tasting like honey, a thin wafer. I'm picturing a glazed donut. That sounds like heaven to me. God gave that to them daily for 40 years. And God commanded Moses to take a jar of that manna and keep it as a reminder of his faithfulness to his people over the next generations. Let's read that in Exodus 16:32. Moses told the people that the Lord said, "Store up 2 liters of this manna because I want future generations to see the food I gave you during the time you were in the desert after I rescued you from Egypt." There are 2 miracles that took place here. The first is that God fed a couple of million people with the bread of heaven for 40 years. And it was just the right food. No gluten allergies, no high-carb diet, no heart-stopping obesity, and no lack of nutrition. God sustained his people miraculously, giving them just what they needed. And he always does. The second miracle is a lesser one, that this manna that Moses was instructed to put into a jar to keep for the next few generations did not spoil as it normally would have. God miraculously preserved it for the long term in order to provide a reminder for his people that he has provided for them, and he will always do so. He is the provider. He is our provider. And he wants us to remember that and be content and be thankful. So this week, and in fact, every week, stop and remember. Remember the graciousness of God and give thanks from a grateful heart. Perhaps no single gift God gave us expresses his graciousness and his love for us and his willingness to provide for us more than sending his Son to die on the cross for our sins. God is willing to forgive us and go to great what's the word I'm looking for? Sacrifice, in order to provide that for us. He is a gracious God, and he is willing to offer you that gift today if you've never accepted it. To come to him and to find the greatest gift that God could provide, the greatest provision that we would ever sense a need for in our lives, eternal life with him. Let's stand and sing our closing song.